Hey guys! Imagine a place where the sun never reaches, a chamber sealed for eternity, carved into the rock beneath a parched landscape. This is not the setting of a thriller, nor the plot of a treasure hunt. It is something far more patient, more enduring. A tomb. A resting place. A world within stone. But what if you were not meant to be there? What if, through accident or misfortune, or perhaps even design, you found yourself sealed behind heavy walls, in a place built to remain undisturbed for all of time? Could you escape? Tonight's tale is not just one of escape attempts, traps, and tunnels. It is a slow, winding journey through the real tombs of history. It is a meditation on the architecture, rituals, materials, beliefs, and the quiet human details that filled these timeless places. You'll hear about people who entered tombs, some to build, some to loot, some by accident, and some who never returned. You'll lie with them beneath the dust. You'll learn how they may have tried to get out. But fear not, this story isn't meant to alarm or provoke unease. It is soft, steady, and thoughtful. A gentle exploration of what it meant to design a space that was never meant to be opened again, and what might happen when someone finds themselves trapped inside one. So, take a breath. Sink slowly into the stillness. Imagine yourself wrapped in cool linen and the sound of your heartbeat in the dark. A torch flickering against ancient murals. A sealed door behind you. An endless time ahead. Let's begin with the daily rhythm of those who built the tombs, those who chiseled, hauled, and carved the earth itself, unaware that sometimes a stone could fall too early, or a tunnel could close too soon. Let us go back to a time when the sun beat down on the sands of Egypt. Imagine the sun rising over the arid hills of western Thebes, casting long shadows across the dusty village of Deir el-Medina. The air is cool in the early morning, but it will not remain so for long. Already, men stir in their homes, modest mud brick structures arranged in narrow rows, preparing for another day of work in the Valley of the Kings. This was a village unlike any other in ancient Egypt. Deir el-Medina housed the workers, artisans, masons, draftsmen, and laborers, who were tasked with the secret and sacred duty of carving the eternal resting places of pharaohs. For centuries, these men and their families lived in this enclosed settlement, shielded from the rest of society, their skills passed from father to son. The life of a tomb builder was both privileged and precarious. On one hand, they were given more rations than most laborers in Egypt, generous portions of bread, beer, and sometimes even meat. They were literate, well-trained, and lived in a tightly organized community. Yet on the other hand, their task was immensely difficult. Hours were spent in dimly lit chambers, chiseling hieroglyphs into hard stone, painting mythological scenes with delicate brushes made from palm fibers, and hauling supplies into cavernous spaces carved into bedrock. The valley they worked in, now famous as the resting place of Tutankhamun and Ramses the Great, was, to them, both a workplace and a trap. Imagine being in one of those narrow corridors, lantern flickering, the walls echoing every movement. The deeper into the mountain you went, the less you could hear the world outside. It wasn't hard to imagine being buried alive. Accidents, while rare, were not impossible. Rockfalls could occur. Sections of tombs could collapse. There are stories, some carved into ostraca, the shards of broken pottery used like notepads, of fears among the workers. They spoke of the breath of the stone, the strange air currents that moved in sealed chambers. They whispered about hearing voices that were only the wind. Sometimes, they worried that the spirits of the dead were watching them work. But most days were simpler. A typical workday began with the sounding of a horn from the foreman's house. Workers would gather, tools slung over their shoulders, copper chisels, wooden mallets, ropes, and baskets. They marched through winding trails into the valley, stopping at various points to rest or receive instructions. Once inside the tomb, torchbearers would light the corridors, and the day's work would begin. There was a rhythm to their lives, a slow, methodical pulse. Each worker had a specific role. The draftsmen sketched preliminary outlines on the plastered limestone walls. Painters followed, applying ochres, blacks, and blues with astonishing precision. Sculptors chiseled raised or sunken reliefs. All worked in near silence, broken only by the tap-tap-tap of hammer on chisel, or the soft whisper of pigment over stone. They knew every inch of these tombs. They understood the layout better than anyone. Yet, even they were not immune to accidents, or fear. One might imagine a worker lingering too long after the others had left. A brief pause to finish a detail, or to fix a mistake. Then the distant sound of rock shifting. A door that never reopened. A light that ran out. What would it feel like to be trapped in such a space? There were usually air shafts, escape tunnels, or small supply corridors, some large enough to crawl through, others barely wide enough to pass an arm. Yet many were sealed as construction advanced. Sealed not with malice, but simply as a step in the process of completion. Still, it is possible, though not often recorded, that one or more may have been lost this way. Entombed not as a king, but as a craftsman. Forgotten. And if you were such a person, could you escape? The answer would depend on where you were when the collapse happened. The deeper into the tomb, the harder it would be to return. Not just physically, but mentally. The air would grow thin. The darkness absolute. Orientation would be nearly impossible. Some tombs featured hidden corridors, perhaps known only to the architect. Others were designed to deceive intruders, with false doors, dead-end tunnels, or cursed inscriptions meant to terrify the superstitious. But to the builder, those deceptions were blueprints. They might know a route out, if they were lucky. If not, they would simply wait. In stillness. In silence. In the heart of a stone mountain. Centuries later, archaeologists would find inscriptions, small unfinished sketches, and even personal belongings left behind in the corridors. Sometimes, they wondered if these were tools dropped in haste, or abandoned when someone failed to return. In this place, death was part of the architecture. Yet even so, life outside continued with quiet dignity. At Deir el-Medina, the workers kept their small gardens, told stories around shared meals, and prayed for safe returns. They honored the gods who ruled the afterlife, and hoped they themselves wouldn't meet them too soon. Now, let us gently leave the echoing taps and low light of the workers' world. Let us follow a different soul, one not from the laborious village, but from a noble lineage. A man who believed the tomb he built would carry him into eternity. In the next segment, we'll step into the sandals of someone who didn't fear being sealed into a tomb, he expected it. He planned it. A pharaoh. A king. Ready to be buried alive, by design. Now, drift gently from the dust-covered tools of Deir el-Medina to a world of opulence and divine symbolism. A world where being sealed in a tomb was not a fear, but a sacred transition. Imagine yourself in the late 13th century BCE. Egypt is flourishing under the rule of the 19th dynasty. The Nile is generous, the temples are thriving, and the pharaoh, Seti I, commands the reverence of gods and men alike. Seti was a king of vision and solemn faith. His name, which means of Set, tied him to the god of storms and strength. But his tomb, his final dwelling, was dedicated to a much larger purpose than simple burial. It was a doorway to eternity. Located in the Valley of the Kings, Tomb KV-17 is not just one of the longest and deepest tombs ever carved into the Liban Hills, it is one of the most elaborately decorated. It stretches more than 450 feet into the limestone cliffs, a labyrinth of corridors, antechambers, and sanctuaries. The descent is steep, symbolic. Each chamber leads further away from the world of the living and deeper into the divine. Seti's tomb is a monument to preparation. Every inch was intentional. From the vaulted ceilings painted with celestial constellations to the walls adorned with sacred texts, everything had purpose. To the modern eye, these appear decorative. To the ancient Egyptian, they were vital. These were maps, spiritual blueprints, instructions for navigating the dangerous and transformative journey of the soul after death. Seti I, like many pharaohs, expected to be sealed away. He welcomed it. Death was not an end but a stage. His tomb was a carefully controlled environment, one built to sustain his spiritual essence forever. But what if, as some scholars quietly wonder, he had not yet passed when the tomb was sealed? The question seems implausible. Yet, echoes of such possibilities linger in Egyptian folklore. Tales of live burials, royal or otherwise, have haunted the margins of oral tradition. Not as punishment, but as a divine offering. A king entombed while alive, willingly or not, may have been seen as a bridge between realms. Of course, no inscription confirms this. The Egyptians recorded their victories and pieties, not their accidents or regrets. But let us imagine, gently, softly, what such an experience might have entailed. If Seti had entered his tomb prematurely, if, say, an illness took him near death, and the priests interpreted his coma as his passing, he would have awoken in absolute darkness. The sarcophagus, a monolithic piece of alabaster, would be sealed. The air thin. The stone unmoving. There would be no light to see the scenes painted for his benefit. The Book of Gates. The Book of the Dead. The Litany of Ra. All these sacred instructions would vanish in blackness. Even if one were to break free from the sarcophagus, unlikely, but let us imagine, there would be chamber after chamber to navigate, without orientation. Doors shut behind him. Corridors angled downward. Echoes that confuse the sense of direction. Even with a torch, and there would be none, it would be nearly impossible to retrace steps. The walls themselves would offer no guidance in the dark. Their messages, profound and plentiful, could only be read by light. Without it, even the wisdom of Thoth was inaccessible. The tomb was meant to be closed forever. Blocks were slid into place. Entrances were backfilled. Seals affixed. Priests performed the opening of the mouth ceremony, allowing the dead to speak in the next world, and then departed. Some tombs, such as Seti's, even had symbolic doors that led nowhere, or were crafted to confuse potential intruders. Massive stone plugs could drop from ceiling niches. False ceilings. Staircases that ended abruptly. In many ways, these were traps not for the living, but for time itself. The goal was not just protection from robbers, it was separation from this world. Still, one wonders, could Seti, or anyone placed in such a place before death, have escaped? Physically, the odds were against it. Tombs were engineered to seal from the outside. The angles, the narrow doorways, the multi-ton slabs, they were final. Even if someone inside were healthy and armed with tools, they would need hours, days, perhaps, to breach just one sealed passage. An air? In the inner chambers, it would be limited. But spiritually, symbolically, Seti's escape was never meant to be literal. He was not trying to flee. He was trying to transform. The entire tomb was designed as a cocoon of death and rebirth. Let us pause here and consider one of the most beautiful chambers of the tomb. The Hall of Beauties, it is sometimes called. It is a long room whose ceiling arches overhead like the night sky, painted deep blue and sprinkled with stars. The goddess Nut stretches from wall to wall, her limbs the canopy of heaven. Beneath her, the king becomes a god. In this space, Seti was not trapped. He was ascending. The silence was not loneliness, but communion. The darkness was not death, but gestation. And when the tomb was sealed, it was not abandonment, but completion. From our modern view, being sealed in a tomb stirs anxiety. But for Seti, it was triumph. And yet, centuries later, robbers did find his tomb. They carved secret entrances. They stole artifacts, chipped paintings, and disturbed what had been so carefully arranged. Later still, archaeologists entered, and preservationists, and tourists. The tomb no longer functions as it was meant to. Its sanctity was eroded by curiosity. And still, it speaks. The walls whisper stories. The halls carry footfalls. But the spirit of Seti I, if one believes in such things, was long gone. Either into the stars, as he intended, or lost to the darkness, as some feared. As we leave his tomb, imagine the weight of the stone door sliding shut behind you. Feel the air change. Cool, still, timeless. Now, let us step sideways. Not to a pharaoh or a builder, but to those who came centuries later, seeking treasure or knowledge or simple mischief, and found themselves locked inside by misstep or misfortune. In the next segment, we will explore real stories, some documented, others whispered, of individuals who became trapped in tombs. Not kings. Not priests. Just people. Close your eyes and imagine the scent of ancient stone, the kind that's been untouched for centuries. Not sharp or dusty, but dense, like the earth itself, thick with history and stillness. Picture yourself walking into a space where air hasn't moved freely for 1,000 years. And now imagine the entrance ceiling behind you. It has happened more often than one might expect. Unlike the romanticized idea of tomb raiders galloping away with gold, real incidents of people becoming trapped in tombs, or similar underground enclosures, are often quiet, unremarkable, and eerily lonely. Let us begin in Roman Egypt, sometime during the 2nd century CE. A papyrus fragment, now housed in the British Museum, contains a strange report. A group of young boys had entered a small burial chamber in the cliffs above the Nile. Whether they were curious, playing, or imitating rituals they didn't understand, we cannot know. But a rockfall, perhaps caused by their own movements, sealed the entrance. A search ensued. The parents brought workers and priests. But it took days to locate the chamber, and even then, the sandstone had compacted too tightly to allow air or sound through. By the time the children were recovered, they had succumbed to the heat, the stillness, and the lack of oxygen. No murals recorded their story. No scarabs or scrolls were buried with them. Their tomb had not been intended for the living. But for a time, it held them anyway. And then there is the case of Yusuf al-Mutawakkil, a Syrian traveler and scholar who ventured to Upper Egypt in the 11th century. His writings are mostly theological, but within one of his travelogues, he makes passing reference to a strange ordeal. He describes entering a tomb near Aswan, an unnamed one, probably far from the known necropolises. The walls, he writes, were inscribed with faded animal gods and long-forgotten royal names. As he wandered deeper, torchlight guiding his steps, he became disoriented. What he thought was a circular path brought him into a completely unfamiliar chamber. The tunnel behind had vanished. He described a stone door that was not there before. For 3 days, he remained inside. Alone. Rationing his torch, speaking prayers aloud simply to hear sound, and, at one point, digging at the wall with a bronze dagger he carried for ceremonial purposes. He was eventually found by his companions, who had waited outside. They had not seen the door shift, nor heard his cries. Al-Mutawakkil attributed the event to divine mischief. Perhaps a test. Or perhaps the tomb was never meant to be disturbed. Other tales are more modern, if still wrapped in folklore. In 1901, an Egyptian guide known only as Habib reportedly vanished while leading a German tourist group through an unmapped tomb near Drah Babu el Noga. The entrance collapsed after a minor quake. The tourists were rescued within hours by local villagers, but Habib could not be reached. For days, they dug. His body was never recovered. But weeks later, another guide reported hearing a tapping sound from within a sealed shaft nearby. Could it have been wind? A trick of echo? Or something else? In these stories, what's most striking is not the fear, but the quiet. Those who've written about such entrapments often mention the silence before anything else. Not panic. Not darkness. But the absolute, engulfing absence of sound. Imagine being in a chamber beneath tons of rock. No air movement. No creaking wood or buzzing insects. Just your own breathing, your heartbeat, and the memory of footsteps long gone. And yet, some did survive. One such story comes from the early 1800s. A young Egyptian named Mahdi, assisting an English explorer named Sir Henry Salt, was lowered into a shaft in a newly uncovered tomb near Luxor. The rope, perhaps frayed or poorly secured, snapped. Mahdi fell more than 20 feet into a corridor partially filled with rubble. For nearly 2 days, he remained alone. Salt and his men were unable to reach him at first, and the shaft was too narrow for most adults. They eventually lowered a small child with water and food. Mahdi, when rescued, said little. He had kept his oil lamp lit for the first night, then extinguished it to preserve the wick. He sat in silence, listening to the walls. He said he heard voices. Likely, he meant echoes of his own movement. But he was never quite the same afterward. Such experiences, while not always fatal, leave impressions. Deep ones. The tomb, in these accounts, becomes more than a structure. It becomes a presence. A space with personality. With indifference, perhaps, or even a sort of awareness. Modern spelunkers who have explored remote burial caves in the Sinai Peninsula report similar sensations. A sudden chill, even in warm weather. The feeling of being watched. A subtle pressure on the ears, as though the tomb resents being disturbed. All of this is, of course, anecdotal. There is no measurable phenomenon to support the idea that tombs trap people deliberately. And yet, history is full of sealed doors. Not all of them stay closed. From the pyramids of Saqqara to the catacombs beneath Alexandria, Egypt is veined with tunnels, burial shafts, and chambers long lost to time. Many have collapsed. Others remain intact, their interiors still unknown. It is possible, though rarely discussed, that someone, sometime, entered one such space and was never found again. Not murdered. Not cursed. Not pursued. Just sealed away. And in those still moments, when even your own heartbeat seems too loud, there is no panic. Only waiting. Only breath. Only stone. Let us now move from these accidental entrapments to something more calculated. More complex. In the next segment, we will gently explore the many ingenious ways ancient Egyptians, and later civilizations, designed tombs specifically to confuse, delay, or mislead anyone who dared enter them. A labyrinth of traps, false passages, blind doors, and secrets. Let us now step slowly into the tomb not as a visitor or a victim, but as someone encountering a puzzle. A labyrinth of stone. Not merely a place of burial, but a structure designed to confound, delay, and sometimes even trap. The ancient Egyptians, perhaps more than any other culture, perfected the art of deception in death. In the golden sands of Thebes and the cliffs of Saqqara, the architects of the afterlife used every tool at their disposal not only to honor the dead but to confuse the living. Tombs were not just built, they were engineered. Not just designed, they were layered in secrets. False doors, hidden chambers, decoy corridors, entire passageways carved with no other purpose than to mislead. Begin, if you will, by picturing the long, sloping descent into a typical New Kingdom tomb. The entrance is carved into a cliff face, angled down into the rock. At first, the tunnel appears straightforward. Slanted walls, a smooth floor, perhaps a line of hieroglyphs praising the gods. But the further you walk, the more complex it becomes. A right turn leads to an antechamber. A false wall, seamless to the untrained eye, might lie ahead. Beyond that, a low stairway. Or perhaps it leads nowhere. Perhaps it leads in a circle, returning you to where you began, only from the other side. To the unknowing, the tomb is a trap. To the informed, it is a map of belief. Take, for instance, the tomb of Pharaoh Thutmose III, known as KV34 in the Valley of the Kings. Unlike the others, his tomb was carved high into a remote cliff, requiring a steep and narrow climb. Once inside, the passage twists and descends rapidly. The walls are covered not in full-colored murals, but in elegant, cursive hieroglyphs from the Amduat, a funerary text describing the 12 hours of the night through which the sun god travels. It is not meant to be welcoming. It is meant to deter. The layout includes sharp turns, angled ramps, and ceilings that descend unexpectedly. For those unfamiliar with the plan, it would be easy to become lost, even with a torch. And this was deliberate. The Egyptians believed that protecting the body protected the soul. If robbers or enemies reached the mummy, they could destroy the very essence of a person's afterlife. Therefore, misleading them became a sacred duty. False doors were particularly clever devices. These were beautifully decorated panels carved into tomb walls, often inscribed with invocations and offerings. But they led nowhere. They were not meant to be opened by human hands, but by the spirit of the deceased. They served as symbolic portals between the worlds of the living and the dead. But to a looter, or to someone trying to escape, they were dead ends. Worse, some tombs featured entire chambers designed to be traps. Heavy stone blocks would be suspended above passages during construction, meant to drop when triggered. Others had plug stones. Massive cylindrical boulders rolled into corridors that could not be removed once set. In the step pyramid of Dosa, the subterranean complex beneath the pyramid includes over 5 kilometers of narrow tunnels, many of which go nowhere, doubling back upon themselves or ending in smooth, polished stone. Try to imagine crawling through such a tunnel, lamp flickering, air thin, only to reach a polished wall with no door, no inscription. Just silence. Even the famed tomb of Tutankhamun may have been designed with secrets in mind. Some scholars believe a sealed chamber behind the north wall still exists, perhaps containing the burial of Queen Nefertiti. The idea remains unconfirmed. But the very suggestion underscores a truth: even the most modest-looking tombs may conceal vast, undiscovered spaces. Let us pause here. Feel the texture of ancient plaster under your fingertips. Cold. Smooth in places. Chipped in others. The ceiling is low. You crouch slightly, torch in hand. There are 3 doorways before you, one straight, one left, one right. The air smells faintly of oil, dust, and something older. Which way leads out? Which way leads in? You may not know. That uncertainty is the tomb's power. It transforms the living world's logic into a dreamlike space, where paths circle, walls whisper, and the architecture itself seems to fold inward. This was not limited to Egypt. In Petra, in Jordan, the Nabateans carved entire tomb complexes into rose-red cliffs. Some of these include high ledges accessible only by rope or ladder, perhaps to discourage intruders, or to signify spiritual elevation. In Palmyra, Syria, tomb towers with stacked chambers create vertical mazes, rows upon rows of niches, each one anonymous to the untrained eye. In China, the mausoleum of the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, remains largely unexcavated. His famous terracotta army guards the approach, but within the burial mound itself, historical texts speak of rivers of mercury and trap mechanisms set to trigger upon disturbance. Modern researchers have confirmed elevated mercury levels in the soil, suggesting the legend may hold some truth. Even in medieval Europe, ossuaries and crypts sometimes included secret passages meant to isolate holy relics. In the Paris catacombs, narrow tunnels, hundreds of kilometers long, are so complex that explorers have become lost and perished within them. Not tombs, exactly, but vast necropolises, echoing the same principle, burial as isolation. And so we return to our original question. Could you escape? If you found yourself in such a structure, with nothing but darkness and memory, how would you choose? Would you follow the breeze? Feel the floors incline? Would you mark the walls to avoid walking in circles? Or would you simply sit, listening, waiting, becoming part of the place itself? Many who found themselves trapped in these ancient tombs, whether by misfortune or design, were not lost because of distance. They were lost because of silence, because of confusion, because of a structure meant to bend the mind inward, away from escape, and toward eternity. As we move forward, let us step back out of the stone. Let us walk once again beneath the sun, where the tomb is not a place of reverence or fear, but curiosity. In the next segment, we explore the birth of tomb exploration as a profession. The early archaeologists, surveyors, and accidental adventurers who descended into the tombs not to loot, but to learn. And sometimes, to get lost along the way. Let the wind of centuries blow softly now, rustling through the dry sands of 18th century Egypt. The age of empires has come and gone, and in its wake, new kinds of travelers have begun arriving, not to conquer, not to plunder, but to observe. To study. To open what had long been closed. These men and women. Early antiquarians, surveyors, and Egyptologists did not always know what they were walking into. They carried lanterns instead of torches, sketchbooks instead of shovels. But they were not immune to the same timeless risks that face tomb robbers or lost children. The moment you enter a space never meant to be reopened, you risk not being able to leave. One of the earliest accounts comes from Richard Pocock, an English clergyman who toured Egypt in the 1730s. In his notes, he describes entering several rock-cut tombs near Thebes. He wrote of the thick, choking air, the oppressive silence, and a peculiar disorientation that set in after just a few minutes underground. He never reported being trapped, but he described becoming separated from his guide in the dark. For what he claimed was no more than a few minutes, he could not find the exit. And in those moments, he wrote, the weight of all history pressed down upon my mind. Nearly a century later, the famed Italian explorer Giovanni Battista Belzoni ventured far deeper. Belzoni was not a traditional archaeologist, he had once worked as a circus strongman in England. But his interest in Egyptian antiquity was genuine, and in 1817, he undertook one of the first systematic entries into several royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. In his journal, he details the discovery of the tomb of Seti I, KV-17. Upon breaking through the entrance, he and his small team descended rapidly, unaware of the scope of the structure. At one point, Belzoni reports becoming physically separated from his companions. He writes, "The passage was narrow, and I had turned to follow a draught of air. The lantern flickered. The wall ahead was smooth. No door. I returned, or thought I had. Yet the passage turned strangely, and I could not find the stair again. He was not trapped in the physical sense, he was not buried, or sealed. But he was, for a time, directionless within stone. Disoriented. Alone. He eventually found his way back by marking the floor with ash and tracing it backward. Even today, archaeologists use similar methods: string lines, chalk marks, careful mapping. In spaces where light fades quickly and rooms echo faintly, these low-tech solutions are critical. The tomb is not hostile. But it is indifferent. It has no interest in helping you leave. Auguste Mariette, another pioneer, experienced a more physical form of entrapment in the 1850s. While excavating in Saqqara, he entered a tomb shaft that had partially collapsed. Without knowing it, his team above had accidentally dislodged debris that fell across the entrance. For over a day, he remained inside with only a lamp and a limited supply of air. In his later writings, he recounts the moment he accepted he might not be rescued. I sat in the chamber and looked upon the painted figures on the wall. I thought, if I must stay here, let me be still. Let me observe. The ancients intended this place to last. I shall not be the first to remain. He was, of course, rescued. But his experience reflects something fundamental. To be locked in a tomb is not necessarily to panic, but to enter a new relationship with time. The early explorers often approached these places with reverence, but sometimes also with naivete. Entrances that had lasted for thousands of years could collapse in minutes. The very act of opening a tomb could destabilize it. Dust clouds could obscure exits. Shifting rock could close narrow passageways behind them. In 1907, a young assistant working with British archaeologist Edward Ireton reportedly became trapped in a minor tomb shaft for nearly 5 hours. His candle went out. He was without rope, and the shaft's entrance was too high to reach by climbing. The silence, he later said, was worse than the dark. But even silence has a rhythm in a tomb. A pulse. Breathing echoes back. Footsteps reverberate. And somewhere, if one listens closely, there may be the sound of history itself, pressing in from all sides. Let us pause here. Picture yourself in the boots of one of those early explorers. Your clothes damp with sweat. A lantern in one hand. A notebook in the other. You are deep within a structure unseen for centuries. The air is thick. Your steps are muffled. You hear the shift of stone above, natural, you hope. But what if? You turn. You retrace. The corridor is not the one you entered. The chamber seems deeper. The floor slightly uneven. Had you gone left before? Or right? Even seasoned scholars describe these moments. Not panic, but quiet confusion. To escape a tomb, one must first know where they are. And in places built to disorient, even the educated can become unsure. Today, modern archaeologists benefit from satellite maps, fiber optic cameras, and remote sensing technology. But many of the early discoveries came from lanterns, intuition, and hand-drawn sketches. And in those silent spaces, the chance of entrapment, temporary or permanent, was always near. But what of those who entered the tombs not to study, but to exploit? In the next segment, we will wander the shadowy path of the ancient tomb robbers. Their risks were higher, their intentions darker. And for many of them, the tomb was not just a place to steal, but the last place they would ever see. Now, let us lower the lantern once again and step even deeper into the gloom, into the side of history whispered about in warnings and half-erased papyri. For where there are treasures, there will always be those willing to risk everything to take them. And in ancient Egypt, tomb robbing was not just a crime, it was a dangerous gamble with one's life. Unlike the cautious explorers of modern centuries, ancient tomb robbers moved under cover of night, often entering by stealth through partially collapsed shafts or secret openings long forgotten. They didn't carry maps or mark their way. They moved fast. They took chances. And many of them never made it back out. Tomb robbery was already an old profession by the time of the New Kingdom. In fact, several papyrus scrolls from the 20th dynasty, such as the Abbot Papyrus, record court trials of tomb robbers caught desecrating royal resting places. These texts describe how robbers would pry open sarcophagi, steal gold amulets, tear linen from mummies, and leave chaos in their wake. But the texts also mention something else: missing men. Associates who were said to have gone into the tomb and never returned. Picture it. A group of desperate men, perhaps former laborers or soldiers fallen on hard times, gather near the cliffs of Deir el-Medina. They've heard whispers of a tomb only half sealed, forgotten by the authorities. By moonlight, they descend into the earth. The walls close in. Their torchlight flickers across ancient paintings. They move fast, too fast. A tunnel has narrowed since it was last used. A wooden beam groans under shifting stone. And then, silence. There are no witnesses to most tomb robber deaths. But some tombs tell their own stories. In 1923, Howard Carter, while exploring side chambers around Tutankhamun's tomb, found evidence of an older attempted break-in. Tools, shattered pottery, and what appeared to be the partial remains of a man's foot, crushed beneath a stone slab that had collapsed from above. We don't know his name. We don't know when he entered. But it seems he tried, and failed, to escape. Other tombs, particularly those in less guarded parts of the Theban necropolis, have yielded similar finds: broken rope ladders, collapsed passageways with soot marks from ancient torches, even the skeletal remains of individuals found wedged in narrow crevices. Likely, they were robbers trying to squeeze past traps or gain access to secondary burial chambers. And what of those traps? While ancient Egyptian tombs were not always the death trap-laden labyrinths imagined in movies, some did employ clever deterrents. Collapsible ceilings, false walls, sudden drop-offs, and, in rare cases, stone doors that could only be opened from the outside. A robber might enter easily, but the way out would be gone the moment a trigger was disturbed. In one tomb in the Valley of the Kings, a long downward shaft was discovered to have once been filled with loose gravel and debris, designed to collapse beneath the weight of an intruder. It's believed a small group of robbers entered, and when they stepped onto the wrong stones, the shaft caved in. Later excavators found human bones under layers of stone, a grim confirmation. Tomb robbers were also subject to psychological terror. Even in antiquity, curses were believed to protect sacred spaces. Walls were inscribed with warnings: "Cursed be he who disturbs this tomb. May his heart stop, and his limbs rot." It didn't take long in the dark, stale air for a man to start believing in such things. Trapped in a maze of painted stone, with no light, no breeze, and the weight of divine wrath upon you, many robbers may have panicked. Some might have run into the wrong tunnel. Others may have become paralyzed with fear, wasting precious minutes until their torches died. And yet, the robberies continued. Even the tomb of Ramses VI was broken into shortly after his burial. The temptation of gold outweighed the risk of death or entrapment. But again and again, we find signs of failure. Not just looted chambers, but partially looted ones. Robbers who never finished the job. Footprints leading in, none leading out. Abandoned bags of goods. Scorch marks in areas that had no known exit. If you were one of them, crawling through tight corridors, lungs filled with dust, sweat dripping from your brow, could you stay calm if your only rope ladder gave way? Could you backtrack through a tunnel that now looked unfamiliar, where every painted figure on the wall seemed to shift in the darkness? One papyrus, the Amherst Papyrus, even tells of robbers who claimed to hear voices inside a tomb. Whispers they could not explain. Perhaps the wind through a tunnel. Perhaps their own minds. Or perhaps something else. Let us step back now, gently. Not all who entered tombs sought riches. Some were drawn by mystery. But for those who did come for gold and left with nothing, not even their lives, the tomb became their prison, their grave, and their warning. But tombs were not only spaces of theft and loss. Some people were buried with the intention that others would come, eventually. In the next segment, we'll look at the unexpected, the ritualistic returns. The priests who re-entered tombs to perform rites, deliver offerings, or even rearrange bodies. And we'll ask, what did they find when they walked into the silence? Let us take a slow breath. Not all who entered the tombs of ancient Egypt did so in desperation or darkness. Some returned with purpose. With reverence. With offerings of incense and bread and jars of scented oil meant not for the living, but for the Ka, the spirit of the departed. You see, in the long shadow of death, ancient Egyptians did not view the tomb as an entirely final destination. No, it was more like a threshold, a sacred space connecting the world of the living and the land beyond the western horizon. And so, in certain periods, particularly during the New Kingdom and into the late period, select individuals were permitted to re-enter tombs. Not to disturb, but to nourish. Not to steal, but to honor. These were the priests of the funerary cults. Imagine the scene, a small group of men, clad in clean linen robes, walking in the early dawn toward the necropolis. The desert is still cool, the stars fading in a violet sky. One carries a censer. Another, a sealed jar of wine. A third, a scroll containing prayers to Osiris and Anubis. They pass familiar paths, step over windblown stones, and descend once again into the home of the dead. But these priests were not blind to danger. The tomb, even for them, was never fully safe. By the time many of these rituals were being carried out, tombs had aged. Stones had shifted. Sand had accumulated. Even the priests themselves may have struggled to locate the correct passage or keyhole. Some had to crawl through partially collapsed shafts, avoiding scorpions, bats, or air thick with spores. Still, they went. Their role was vital, they brought sustenance to the spirits. In Egyptian belief, the offerings placed during the burial were not enough forever. The deceased required ongoing attention, particularly kings and nobles whose cults were maintained at state or family expense. Sometimes, priests found things out of place. Graffiti from the time, yes, even the ancient Egyptians left their scribbles. Suggests that priests entering tombs would occasionally discover signs of earlier intrusions. Open coffers. Dislodged seals. Missing items. One faded inscription in the tomb of Ramos in Thebes records a priest lamenting the disorder: the holy box is broken, the scent jars overturned, no bread for the Ka. These were not just comments. They were reports. Notes left behind as part of the tomb's spiritual audit. And what of the risks? There are cases, rare but haunting, of priests who may not have made it back. In one small tomb near Saqqara, a set of sandals, neatly placed at the tomb's threshold, was found beside a broken oil lamp. But no trace of the priest to whom they belonged. Some believe he fell through a weakened floor stone and became trapped below, in an annex never fully mapped. Others think he may have succumbed to fumes, methane or some other natural gas trapped within a sealed chamber. To serve the dead could mean joining them. More commonly, though, these sacred return visits were brief and precise. The priest would enter, chant the offering prayer. HTPDINSWINPDA, a boon that the king gives, and that Anubis allows. He would light incense, anoint the offering table, perhaps pour a small libation, and then leave, closing the door with a mixture of care and fear. And yet, these moments allowed the tomb to become something living again. A place not of silence and dust alone, but of continued relationship. Connection. Memory. What's particularly fascinating is that in many larger tomb complexes, especially royal ones, some passages were built specifically to allow priests to perform these rites without disturbing the central burial. Small corridors angled downward, leading to offering rooms that sat above or beside the burial chamber, allowing access for centuries after the interment. But these side passages could also be confusing. Many were built to be disorienting to strangers. A visitor who didn't know which turn to take could quickly find themselves staring into pitch blackness, with no air movement to guide them, no echo to bounce direction, no torch left burning. Even for the faithful, the tomb could be perilous. And then, the tombs were abandoned. The great cults lost their funding. The priests faded into history. Tomb entrances were buried by landslides, hidden by shifting sands, or repurposed for other uses. Some were entirely forgotten. But there's something haunting in the thought that, for a time, a few voices continued speaking to the dead. That among the many who entered tombs to rob or explore, there were those who came to serve, to kneel by a stone slab and whisper a blessing into the dark. In the next segment, we'll explore what those whispers may have stirred. We'll uncover the psychological effects of prolonged time in sealed tomb spaces, disorientation, hallucinations, sensory deprivation. And what happens when a person begins to lose all sense of time and place? Close your eyes now, if they aren't already. Take a moment to imagine it: no flicker of sunlight, no familiar smell of earth or trees, no birdsong in the distance. Only silence. Only dark. Imagine you are in that place not for minutes, but for hours. This is the mental journey of a person trapped inside a tomb. While much of our exploration has focused on the physical realities of escape, tools, architecture, dangers, we now step into the far more treacherous terrain of the human mind. Because if you were sealed into an ancient Egyptian tomb, perhaps the greatest danger wouldn't be falling rock or low oxygen. It would be your own thoughts. Human beings are built to track time by light, sound, and motion. When those cues disappear, the mind begins to drift. It loses its grasp on time, identity, even reason. In deep caves and dark tombs, individuals have reported powerful hallucinations after only a few hours. Shapes appear that are not there. Whispers arise from nothing. Memories blur. The boundaries between real and imagined dissolve. And tombs were particularly fertile grounds for such breakdowns. The walls themselves might appear to move in the shifting light of a dying torch. Shadows, cast by relief carvings or broken stones, can create eerie silhouettes. In moments of silence, the ear becomes so hungry for input that it creates noise, footsteps behind you, faint voices from a sealed chamber, the sound of breathing that is not your own. This phenomenon has been noted by cave explorers and archaeologists alike. Some have described feelings of being watched, of presences just outside the torch's glow. Others recount the sudden onset of panic, an irrational certainty that something ancient and wrong has woken and is approaching. Now, consider this not for 10 minutes but for hours, or days. There are documented cases of people who have survived in sealed, dark environments, only to emerge deeply traumatized. In 1907, an Egyptian worker became trapped during excavations near Dasha. He was found 2 days later curled in a fetal position, whispering prayers to Osiris and refusing to speak for nearly a week. His experience was never fully understood. He could not say whether he had fallen asleep, hallucinated, or entered what he called the breath of death. Even trained explorers have struggled. Howard Carter himself noted in his journals that a disturbing silence of King Tutankhamun's tomb before it was opened. One entry reads, "It is as if the air has learned to wait. A place so still it begins to echo your thoughts." But what exactly causes this descent into disorientation? First, the lack of light. Prolonged darkness alters the brain's production of melatonin and serotonin, hormones that govern sleep and mood. Without a day-night cycle, your internal clock starts to desynchronize, making hours stretch into an endless present. Then there's oxygen deprivation. Even a slow reduction in breathable air can impair judgment. You may not notice that you're becoming confused or dizzy. Your thoughts begin to loop. Your muscles feel weak. Time slips. Add in hunger, dehydration, and fear, and the mental collapse accelerates. Worse still is sensory deprivation. The brain, starved for stimulation, begins to generate its own. Patterns in stone become faces. The curve of a shadow becomes a snake. Ancient murals seem to move. A hieroglyph begins to speak. One explorer who entered a lesser-known tomb near Luxor in 1954 wrote, "At some point, I thought I heard laughter, low and echoing, as if from a place beneath the floor. I knew there was no one. But I still turned and asked, 'Who's there?' This is the essence of entombment. Your mind doesn't merely suffer, it begins to create. And here lies the true peril. If you lose the ability to distinguish between real and illusion, escape becomes far less likely. You may turn away from the correct path, believing it unsafe. You might sit and wait for help that is not coming, convinced that you heard footsteps. You may even begin to believe that you are not supposed to leave. There are modern parallels, of course. Astronauts, submarine crews, and miners are all trained to manage extended isolation and darkness. But even they operate under controlled conditions, with plans, technology, and teams standing by. Imagine instead that you are alone. In a sacred tomb not seen for thousands of years. With a failing torch. And silence pressing on all sides. You would begin to understand what it means to lose track, not just of where you are, but of who you are. In the next segment, we shift from the mind to the myths. We'll explore the ancient Egyptian beliefs about curses, spirits, and supernatural guardians. Ideas that might make being trapped in a tomb feel far more personal and far more terrifying. Let's ease our breathing again. As we walk slowly through the echoing chambers of a sealed tomb, let's recall one quiet truth: this space was never meant for the living. For the ancient Egyptians, a tomb was not a grave, it was a house of eternity. A portal between the physical world and the afterlife. And like any sacred gateway, it was heavily protected. Not always with traps or physical obstacles, but with something more subtle. And far more chilling. Curses. Let's begin with what curses actually meant in ancient Egypt. They were not the dramatic, cinematic threats of modern imagination. You wouldn't find skulls engraved with warnings or walls that burst into flame if crossed. Instead, curses were written carefully, sometimes in red ink, the color of chaos, inscribed on door lintels, jars, or even false passageways. They were messages. Warnings not for the curious, but for the wicked. One such inscription, found in the tomb of Kentikere reads, "As for all men who shall enter this tomb, impure, there will be judgment. I shall seize his neck like a bird. I shall wring his head." Another, simpler and perhaps more unsettling, simply says, "He who disturbs the tomb of the pharaoh shall be devoured by a crocodile, a snake, and a hippopotamus." Were these literal threats? To the Egyptians, absolutely. These were not metaphors. They believed the spirit of the deceased, called the Ka, remained active and aware within the tomb. If violated, it could summon vengeance, illness, madness, or even death. And the tools of this spiritual vengeance were numerous. There were servitor statues, placed to act on behalf of the dead. Some held weapons. Some bore spells. Some were buried in sealed niches, positioned to rise when disturbed. Even the famed Ushabti figurines, meant to serve the deceased in the afterlife, could be magically awakened to defend their master. But there's more. Let's talk about the Book of the Dead. Though not a single book but a collection of spells and incantations, it often featured in tombs, written on papyri, carved into walls, painted on coffins. Its texts describe not only the trials of the soul in the afterlife but also the protections placed around the tomb. Spell 125 warns of spiritual judgment. Spell 151 provides rituals for wrapping and protecting the body. Other passages describe magical guardians placed at thresholds, serpents that breathe fire, lions with human heads, spirits that speak in riddles and devour intruders who cannot answer. Were these meant for the soul of the dead or for the living who trespass? It's never entirely clear. Even the simple placement of certain amulets, like the Eye of Horus, the Scarab of Transformation, or the Tie-It Knot, was thought to confer spiritual defense. An amulet wasn't a symbol. It was a weapon. There are also architectural choices that reflect this mindset. Some tombs had false passages, constructed to mislead intruders. Others were built with narrow shafts that led nowhere, just wide enough to tempt a looter to crawl in, only to find a dead end. Symbolically, this created confusion for malicious spirits or enemies, sending them astray. But the most infamous stories of curses come not from ancient papyri, but from modern experience. When Howard Carter opened the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, many believed he had triggered a divine backlash. Within months, Lord Carnarvon, the sponsor of the excavation, was dead. Soon after, other members of the expedition suffered strange accidents, infections, and sudden illnesses. Newspapers at the time gleefully reported the curse of the pharaoh. Skeptics blamed mold, bacteria, coincidence. Believers saw it differently. Yet regardless of your views on curses, there's something undeniably unsettling about entering a space not touched for millennia. A space meant never to be reopened. Where every item, every glyph, every fragment of pottery has remained undisturbed until you arrived. In such a place, even the rational mind begins to waver. You see a statue's shadow shift and wonder, was it always facing that direction? You feel a change in air pressure and imagine a whisper. You hesitate before stepping into a chamber, not because you fear collapse, but because something ancient warns you not to proceed. In many tombs, the builders placed protective spells around the burial chamber, the final sanctum. Not only to protect the dead, but to protect you from what lies within. It was not the dead who needed protection. It was the living. As we move toward the next segment, we will explore the real, physical dangers of ancient tombs that make the notion of escape even more complex: hidden doors, collapsing stones, airless corridors, and tunnels that seem to lead in circles. If a person were trapped, they might not only have to outwit architecture, but escape the illusion that there is even a way out at all. Let's settle back in. The air is still. Our steps are slower now. The lamp in your hand flickers gently against the stone. You feel the dust against your face, the dryness of your throat, the quiet thud of your own heartbeat echoing in the corridor. Tomb design in ancient Egypt was an art, not just in beauty or construction, but in deception. If you were an intruder, or worse, a looter, the tomb was built to confuse you, mislead you, and ultimately trap you. And if you were unfortunate enough to become trapped inside, the very structure itself could become your prison. Let's begin with the basics of layout. Most tombs, especially in the later dynasties and the Valley of the Kings, began with a sloping entrance corridor, sometimes hidden behind a false wall or under layers of rock. The corridor would wind slightly downward, deeper into the earth, no straight lines, only slow, methodical descent. Then came the antechambers. Some were small, designed to throw off intruders with false doorways and blocked passageways. Others were grand, filled with items for the afterlife, furniture, food offerings, tools, and linen. But often, they were not what they seemed. You might think you've entered the main tomb. You haven't. Because then comes a narrowing passage. Your shoulder brushes the sides. Your lamp flickers again. You crouch to move forward, only to emerge into another chamber. Perhaps there's a pit, 2 meters deep, built not to stop you, but to slow you down. Or a slanted shaft that curves back on itself. A spiral you didn't expect. Now you're deeper than you meant to be. And you begin to notice something else. Everything looks the same. The walls, carved in the same patterns. The corners, sharpened into near-perfect right angles. The dust, undisturbed, but thick enough to hide footsteps. You stop and look behind you. Did you turn left or right back there? Was that statue always at the center of the room? Some tombs employed a chilling trick, mirror layouts. 2 identical chambers placed side by side, each with identical entrances and even matching wall art. One leads forward. The other is a dead end. And which one did you enter? Then, you find a sealed door. At first, you feel relief. Doors mean passage, right? Not in an Egyptian tomb. Sealed doors often meant false chambers, rooms designed to waste your time. Some were filled with rubble. Others, carved hastily, gave the illusion of importance but offered no exit. You might spend hours clearing debris, crawling through shafts, only to arrive in a chamber that was never meant to be accessed. And then there's the ceiling. Some ceilings were rigged with hidden collapses, chambers that would crack under the weight of intrusion. If a stone falls behind you, you might not even hear it clearly. You only realize it when you turn around, and the way you came has disappeared behind a curtain of rock. Let's take a moment to pause here. Imagine sitting in one of these chambers. No light. No air moving. No indication of direction. You know the entrance is behind you somewhere, but after 5 turns, 3 descents, and 1 false passage, the path has been erased from memory. Even your own footprints betray you, they scatter and vanish in the powdery dust. And there's another layer of danger. Air. Ancient tombs were sealed. Ventilation shafts, if present, were meant for spiritual breathing, not physical airflow. Some were symbolic, others functional but narrow, offering no escape. If a person was sealed inside, oxygen would become a precious, dwindling resource. Within a few hours, your breath would feel heavier. The air would grow warm, dense. You might feel sleepy. Not because you're relaxed, but because your body is slowly suffocating. And what about sounds? You call out. Your voice echoes, but it doesn't return. The acoustics of tombs are strange. Some carry sound in loops. Your own footsteps arriving back at you seconds later. Others swallow sound entirely. You shout, and nothing answers, not even an echo. Now the psychological strain tightens. You begin to walk in patterns. You pass by the same stone bench 3 times. Was it the same one? You're not sure anymore. The glyphs on the wall seem familiar, but you can't read them, and they might be repeating. Then, something strange happens. You find a hole. Just large enough for a body to crawl through. Was it dug by a tomb robber centuries ago? Was it an escape route, or a trap? You lower yourself in. The rock scrapes your arms. Your lamp flickers again. The passage narrows, tighter, tighter still. Now you cannot turn around. And you think, this was a mistake. And yet, this is exactly what tomb builders intended. Some even designed robber tunnels, fake escape shafts leading into blank walls. Others placed reverse slopes, where progress would trick you into thinking you're ascending when you're actually going deeper. And then, sometimes, there is no tomb chamber at all. Some tombs were never finished. The sarcophagus chamber remains uncut, the walls bare, the purpose incomplete. You find yourself in a tomb built for someone who never arrived. You are its only occupant. And the silence tells you this. There is no exit. Not because it was locked, but because it was never meant to be escaped. Let your breathing slow. Feel the quiet around you. No danger here. Just shadows of thought and the soft drift of history. You are locked inside a tomb. But now, let's imagine something remarkable. You're aware of your situation. You know you're inside a chamber once sealed for eternity. And now your task is simple in theory, but overwhelming in practice, to escape. But how do you stay calm when your surroundings were designed to break your spirit? Let's start with the mind. Psychologists who study isolation environments, like cavers, deep-sea divers, and astronauts, report similar patterns of mental strain. After extended periods in low-stimulus environments, the human mind begins to distort time, memory, and perception. In a tomb, this begins almost immediately. There are no windows, no clocks, no change in temperature or light. The seconds blur into minutes, minutes into hours. You may begin to think you've been inside for days, when only an hour has passed. Then comes panic. Your brain is wired to seek patterns, to orient itself. But in the ancient tomb, patterns are either missing, or worse, misleading. A hallway that looks familiar may lead to another chamber. Symbols that seem like maps are often prayers, poems, or warnings. So the first rule is this: don't trust familiarity. Each turn you take should be marked, visibly, physically. This might mean using chalk, scratching a symbol, arranging stones in patterns, or leaving behind scraps of fabric. If you brought nothing with you, dust itself becomes your ally. A smear with your hand. A scuff from your foot. Even a whisper of breath can disturb the dust. And then, there's your emotional control. Panic is a luxury you cannot afford. Hyperventilation uses up precious oxygen. So do tears, screams, and rapid movement. Ancient tombs were tightly sealed. Even if small air pockets exist, they can vanish quickly if you waste your breath. So how do you center yourself? Oddly enough, tomb escape isn't unlike deep meditation. Close your eyes. Breathe slowly. Your best strategy is calm calculation. Next, let's talk about light. If you're fortunate enough to have a flame, a torch, a lantern, or even a candle, you must manage it like gold. Flames in tombs consume oxygen. The more you burn, the faster the air disappears. So the light must flicker only when needed. Let your eyes adjust to the dark. Ancient walls can reflect the tiniest flame with surprising reach. Some explorers, especially those who investigated tombs in the 1800s and early 1900s, carried lamps fueled by oil or animal fat. These burned slowly, but the smoke could cause choking or hallucinations in tight chambers. So what if your flame goes out? Then you turn to touch. The walls of many tombs are carved, but carefully. A hallway with chisel marks might indicate rushed construction, a looter's tunnel, or an emergency passage. A perfectly smooth wall might be ceremonial, not functional. You run your fingers along the edges. Corners are a clue. Rounded edges often signal false walls, quickly built to confuse. Sharp, measured corners usually indicate planned passageways. Then comes sound. If you're lucky enough to carry something to tap, a piece of metal, a stone, you may use echoes to judge distance. A short echo? The chamber is small. A long, strange echo? Perhaps a hallway or shaft. No echo at all? You're surrounded, likely in a sealed room. But even these techniques aren't foolproof. Some chambers were carved to absorb sound deliberately, part of their spiritual purpose. In such places, footsteps seem to vanish, and even your own voice returns as a muffled murmur. This can be deeply disorienting. And then there's the greatest enemy of all, hope. Yes, hope. Because hope can become a double-edged blade. The belief that an exit is near might drive you forward, into tighter tunnels, into narrower shafts, into places where no human was meant to go. Desperation often leads people to crawl downward, convinced that light or freedom lies just a bit farther. But in tombs, down is almost always wrong. Egyptians buried their dead beneath ground level. The burial chamber is almost always the lowest point. If you descend too far, you may reach the dead, but never return to the living. The most intelligent escapees, in theory, would fight that instinct. Instead, they'd track airflow. Yes, dare. You might feel it as a whisper on your skin. Or hear it in the flames' movement. A slight flicker can suggest a hidden crack, a forgotten shaft, or even an air vent placed during construction. Ancient builders weren't trying to kill themselves, after all. They needed to enter and exit safely during construction, and sometimes those routes were left behind, even sealed lightly with mud bricks or soft limestone. And if you're strong enough to break through, you may find light. Now let's imagine, just for a moment, you do find such a vent. Narrow. Jagged. Too tight to walk. You begin to crawl. You leave everything behind, your bag, your tools, maybe even your shoes. The rock rakes your skin. Every inch forward is a decision. Each breath shallower than the last. You have no way to know what lies ahead. But you crawl anyway. And then, you feel it. Cool air. Real, flowing, unmistakable air. The kind that moves. The kind that breathes. And somewhere up ahead, just past the shadow, is freedom. Or is it? Because some tomb shafts lead to air traps. Places where wind flows, but walls remain unbroken. And once you're inside such a shaft, you cannot turn around. Your shoulders scrape the walls. The space grows narrower. And in your heart, that glimmer of hope begins to fade. And yet, if the stars align, and the builders made a mistake, or if the tomb you're in was never properly sealed, there might be a passage, cracked open by time, by earthquakes, by careless footsteps. And the sand shifts. And the stone gives. And your head rises, into moonlight. Let us now drift gently into the quiet chamber of the mind, where reality and imagination blur under the weight of stone. Picture yourself once again inside the tomb, the final door now closed. The air is still. The light is fading. There is no sound but your heartbeat, echoing like the steady beat of a ceremonial drum. This is not merely a physical space now, it has become a psychological realm of uncertainty, fear, and introspection. In this 12th segment, we explore the profound mental effects of being trapped underground, isolated from time and stripped of the senses that tie us to the world above. To begin, let's imagine the very moment the final stone slab slides shut behind you. The realization creeps in slowly, as if it, too, must navigate the darkness. There is no obvious way out. Your mind, which has followed you calmly through tunnels, stairs, and shadowy halls, now turns inward. You begin to hear more than you ever did before, the scrape of your fingernails on limestone, the faint hiss of your own breathing, the distant trickle of what might be water, or might be something else. Psychologically, confinement in a tomb-like space can trigger a cascade of emotional responses. The first is sensory deprivation. Without natural light, your circadian rhythms begin to disintegrate. Minutes stretch into what feel like hours. Hours dissolve into something less measurable. In this type of environment, the human mind can lose its grip on time within just a few cycles of wakefulness and sleep. Some experiments conducted in modern times, such as long-term isolation studies in darkened environments, show that people begin to experience visual and auditory hallucinations after just a few days. These aren't always terrifying. At first, they can seem like harmless daydreams, the flicker of movement in the corner of your eye, a gentle whisper like wind through reeds, a memory of sunlight. But as time passes and the body weakens, these hallucinations can deepen into complex narratives, often involving ancestors, lost voices, or the presence of something else in the chamber, something unseen, but sensed. Then there's the matter of space perception. In tightly enclosed areas, particularly those filled with strange geometries, slanted walls, uneven corridors, blind corners, the brain struggles to maintain a reliable mental map. You may feel like you're walking in circles. You may touch a familiar wall and swear it has changed shape. The effect is disorienting, even maddening. This spatial distortion, when combined with the brain's natural desire to impose meaning on its environment, can lead you to perceive the tomb as something alive, its walls breathing, its stones whispering, its darkness watching. And yet, for some, this descent into silence does not immediately lead to panic. The ancient rhythm of the tomb, the carved symbols, the measured dimensions, the echo of your footfall, may create a kind of meditative state. Some monks in history have sought solitude in underground chambers to be closer to death and rebirth. For them, the tomb is not a prison, but a womb. In such moments, you may feel as though you are no longer simply trapped, you have become part of the tomb itself, integrated into its ancient stillness. But the body cannot ignore its needs for long. Hunger creeps in with a dull ache. Thirst becomes a raw fire in the throat. These physical sensations anchor you back to reality, even as your mind tries to escape it. The survival instinct begins to stir. You might call out, at first in hope, then in desperation. But your voice is swallowed by stone. This is where claustrophobia often takes hold. The pressure of the ceiling seems to lower by inches. The air feels thinner, heavier. You may find yourself pressing your hands to the walls, needing to feel contact, proof that you're still somewhere, that you still exist. Your breathing quickens. Your chest tightens. This panic, if left unchecked, can become overwhelming. Yet even in such dire conditions, humans have demonstrated remarkable resilience. Throughout history, miners, spelunkers, and disaster survivors have endured days or even weeks underground. Their strategies vary, some focus on prayer, some on singing, some on slow, rhythmic movement. Others repeat memories aloud, not only to stay sane, but to remember who they are. In the context of an ancient tomb, these strategies would take on a surreal quality. Reciting a family recipe while sitting beside a 3,000-year-old sarcophagus. Whispering the name of a pet to stave off loneliness, surrounded by jars that once held sacred organs. The overlap of the personal and the historical becomes overwhelming. Every thought, every breath, becomes part of the tomb's history. And there's one more layer to consider, the knowledge that the tomb was not made for escape. Unlike prisons or cellars, tombs were intentionally designed to be final. Doors were sealed with plaster. Passageways were blocked with rubble. Trap mechanisms might have been set to collapse behind you. Every feature is a reminder that this place is supposed to be your end. But you are not a mummy. You are alive. You are thinking. Your fingernails are still sharp. And somewhere in the back of your mind, an ancient impulse awakens, the desire not to die but to survive. And so you begin to explore, not just to understand your prison, but to find a thread, however thin, that might lead you out. Perhaps the tomb is not fully sealed. Perhaps there is a forgotten shaft, a chiseled niche leading upward. Perhaps the builders made a mistake. Or perhaps, like so many in history, you begin to dig, not with tools, but with hands, with hope, and with the quiet strength of the human will. And while the odds are slim, history is not without stories of those who survived being buried alive. Accidents during ancient burials. Premature entombments. Even a few desperate escapes. Whether myth or truth, such stories echo through time like footsteps on a hollow floor. And so, as we reach the quiet end of this segment, we sit with the profound psychological truth: to be locked in a tomb is not merely to face death. It is to sit with it, to learn its shape and scent and silence. And for those few who endure, who cling to reason or dream their way out, the tomb becomes more than a trap. It becomes a crucible. You entered it whole. You may leave it changed. As we continue our descent into the heart of mystery, imagine once more the silence of the ancient tomb surrounding you like a second skin. You have accepted the stillness. You've explored the depth of fear and the quiet strength of hope. Now, with breath steady and mind alert, you begin to act, not in desperation, but with deliberate intention. In this segment, we explore what happens when you begin searching for a way out. We uncover the hidden passageways, forgotten shafts, and secret weaknesses in tomb design that might, just might, offer you a path to freedom. We begin with the question: were ancient tombs ever meant to be reopened? Surprisingly, in some cultures, the answer is yes. While many tombs, especially in Egypt, were meant to be sealed for eternity, others, particularly those of nobility in certain Chinese and Etruscan contexts, were designed to allow priests, family members, or future generations to perform rituals or offer food. These tombs often contained small concealed corridors or air shafts not designed for people, but which might offer a glimmer of hope to someone inside. Imagine noticing a thin current of air brushing against your cheek. In the stillness of your prison, even the faintest breeze would feel like a revelation. Could it be a ventilation shaft? Could it lead upward? You begin to search the walls more carefully, feeling for unnatural lines, subtle gaps in the stonework, changes in texture that could betray hidden architectural features. The stone that once felt eternal now begins to yield secrets. And the secrets of tomb construction are vast. For example, in the Valley of the Kings, some tombs, especially those built during the later New Kingdom, contained complex, winding corridors with false chambers, double doors, and hidden niches meant to fool looters. But builders made mistakes. A tunnel might be carved too far and intersect a natural fault in the rock. A block might be improperly placed and leave a seam. In these imperfections, there is opportunity. You remember the way you entered, down a sloping shaft, through halls lined with reliefs, into the central chamber. But tombs often have more than one level. Some contain subsidiary chambers intended for servants, or for storing food, or simply as decoys. If you can find your way into these lower or side rooms, there might be a structural weakness. Perhaps the ceiling was not reinforced. Perhaps a storage passage was walled off and forgotten. And what about ancient trapdoors? Though rare, some tombs were built with concealed floor openings. These were not meant for escape, but for spiritual symbolism, descending into the underworld, rising into the heavens. Yet these architectural features, often made of lighter stone or wood, could degrade over time and weaken. A solid knock might reveal a hollow beneath your feet. And then there are the vertical shafts. Those deep, narrow holes carved for symbolic reasons, often associated with the soul's ascension or the draining of rainwater in tombs built near cliffs. Too small to climb easily, and often lined with crumbling rock, they are nonetheless openings. And where there is an opening, there is the seed of escape. You search. You tap on walls with a stone, listening for a change in resonance. You feel along the seams where blocks meet, searching for dust trails or the faint scent of air. Your hands are raw now. Your legs ache from crouching, climbing, crawling. The tomb is not merciful to the body. But the mind, sharpened by desperation and lit by purpose, becomes attuned to patterns. And soon you find something. A hairline crack in the wall behind a statue. Oddly symmetrical. Covered in centuries of grime, yet it feels intentional. You dig your fingers in, pull, push, lean your weight. Nothing moves. But you are sure this is no natural fracture. With a sharp rock and time, you begin to scrape away the debris. Hours pass, or perhaps it is days. You don't know. You've lost track of time. But eventually, you uncover a square block, recessed slightly. It might be a sealed doorway. Perhaps a tunnel behind it. Perhaps nothing at all. This is when another element enters the picture: tools. You have none, or almost none. A shard of pottery becomes a wedge. A bone from an offering becomes a lever. A broken torch rod becomes a makeshift pick. These are the instruments of escape, drawn not from technology but from intuition and the ancient instinct to survive. And with enough time, time being the one resource the dead no longer need, you begin to make progress. The stone shifts. Dust falls. A sliver of darkness beyond the wall becomes visible. Your heart quickens. You press forward, widening the gap. The tomb moans with the sound of disturbed silence. You squeeze through the opening and find yourself in a tight passageway sloping downward. Your sense of direction flickers. Are you heading deeper into the earth, or toward a way out? You descend. The passage is barely wide enough to crawl. Your elbow scrapes stone. Your breath fogs in the colder air. But this shaft, unlike the tomb, was not made to be visited. There are no decorations, no symbols, no offerings. Just bare stone, dust, and the whisper of a draft. That draft, soft but unmistakable, pulls you onward. And now we must discuss something truly rare: accidental exits. Tombs were built in geological layers, often within rock formations that change over centuries. An earthquake might shift a wall. Floodwaters might erode a seam. A rockfall in antiquity might have broken through the side of the structure, creating a fissure that opens into a cave system, a fault, or even a buried tunnel used by other builders. There are documented cases where ancient tombs, long thought completely sealed, were discovered due to such accidents. Buried beneath rubble, but with just enough of a gap for air to move. This is the miracle you hope for. You follow the passage until the rock changes, limestone gives way to sandier textures. The ground is uneven now, broken in places. You feel air, not strong, but real, cooler than the tomb air. You move faster. Your limbs scream with fatigue, but you continue. And then a glimmer. Not full light. Not the warmth of day. But a faint, pale glow from the far end of the corridor. Your eyes, long adjusted to darkness, widen in disbelief. You crawl, stumble, reach forward. The gap is small, but you can see it now, a shaft rising toward the surface. Roots dangle from above. There's light from the moon, barely visible. You claw at the stone. Your fingernails crack. Your voice, hoarse and ragged, emerges from your throat in a cry that you barely recognize as your own. You climb. Each movement is agony. But you are climbing toward the surface. Toward the sound of wind. Toward the scent of soil. You reach the top and push through a crust of earth. Your head breaks the surface like a seed sprouting from under a stone. You inhale deeply, air rich with life, with wind, with the scent of the world. You are free. The tomb remains behind, its silence undisturbed once more. But you have returned from it, not as the dead, but as the living. You escaped. And as you lie on the earth, staring at the sky, stars wheeling overhead like the painted ceilings of Pharaoh's tombs, you realize you have seen what few have ever seen, not just the inside of a tomb, but the way out. As the ancient world spiraled through centuries of dynasties, wealth, and ritual, so too did the perpetual cat-and-mouse game between the entombers and the trespassers, the priests and architects who sealed tombs for eternity, and the looters, desperate or daring enough to challenge that permanence. This segment draws us into the cunning interplay of defense and intrusion, of sacred preservation versus human desperation. Imagine yourself standing in the torchlit corridors of a sealed tomb, trying to decipher the traps left behind centuries ago, are not merely architectural hazards, but statements of warning, vengeance, and power. The tombs of Egypt, particularly those in the Valley of the Kings, were designed with extraordinary care to safeguard the remains and treasures of the deceased. It wasn't simply about physical barriers, it was psychological warfare. Secret doors, false passages, cursed inscriptions, and deadly traps were all deployed like silent sentinels in a realm of darkness. These weren't mere legends. Archaeologists have discovered pits dug into passageways, shafts that dropped intruders into deep cavities, and tunnels filled with heavy stone blocks designed to collapse. Some tombs even had hidden compartments sealed so seamlessly into the walls that only the most precise knowledge of the tomb's layout could reveal them. These deceptive designs required exceptional skill from their builders. People who were, by their very participation in the burial, now guardians of state secrets. They often took these secrets to their own tombs, leaving behind blueprints known only to a few and often lost entirely after their deaths. Yet, despite all these measures, tomb robbing in ancient Egypt was rampant. Some raids occurred only decades after a tomb's construction, sometimes even within a few years. It was a known risk, and it haunted every dynasty. Many of the royal tombs discovered by modern archaeologists, including those of great pharaohs, showed signs of early intrusion. The robbers often entered through ventilation shafts or cracked open rear chambers, bypassing or sometimes enduring the very traps that were meant to destroy them. The economic motive was obvious: gold, jewels, ceremonial statues, precious ointments, and textiles could be traded, melted down, or reused. For many ancient Egyptians living under heavy taxation and food shortages, the wealth of the dead was simply too tempting to ignore. And while the state condemned tomb robbing with public trials and brutal punishments, it's likely that in some cases, local officials or laborists looked the other way, or even participated. Still, there were those who believed the robbers would pay a price beyond the physical realm. Tomb inscriptions warned of divine retribution, blindness, madness, disease, or death. These curses were less about supernatural wrath and more about psychological deterrence, yet their wording was vivid. One tomb warned that a violator would be torn apart by crocodiles and scorpions, and another invoked the goddess Sekhmet to rain destruction upon the intruder's descendants. Over time, the art of trap-making evolved. During the Middle Kingdom, tombs started featuring more misleading passageways. By the New Kingdom, architects had mastered the use of vertical shafts. Seemingly simple pits that were nearly impossible to cross. Later, in the Ptolemaic period, traps became more symbolic, less likely to kill, but no less intimidating, like corridors filled with intimidating statues or rooms where the air itself turned sour from years of decomposition and ancient chemicals. Imagine now a tomb raider, perhaps in the 9th century BCE, creeping into the Valley of the Kings under the veil of night. His footsteps echo against limestone walls, torchlight flickering across hieroglyphs warning of wrath. Each step might be his last. A wrong move could activate a trap or send him plunging into a pit. But greed outweighs fear. Somewhere ahead lies gold, and perhaps a way out. Or perhaps not. We now know that even King Tutankhamun's tomb, remarkably preserved in modern times, was breached in antiquity. The evidence was subtle, slight disarray in the outer rooms, items hurriedly rifled through. It's believed the tomb was robbed twice before being resealed and forgotten under rubble. And so, sometimes, it wasn't the trap that saved a tomb, but nature itself, sandstorms, rock slides, or simple architectural concealment. In this ancient contest, both sides adapted. Tomb architects refined their designs, looters refined their tools. And yet, both shared a fascination with the unseen. One aimed to protect the secrets of the afterlife. The other aimed to steal them. This strange symmetry created a long shadow that continues into our age, where archaeologists now tread carefully, sometimes nervously, through tombs that may still harbor the mechanisms or curses of an ancient time. Let your mind linger now on the silence of a tomb, untouched for centuries. Dust hangs in still air. Stones remain precisely where they were placed thousands of years ago. Somewhere deep inside, perhaps a trap still waits patiently, its trigger untested, its purpose unfulfilled. We will tread carefully as we move on to our next exploration. What happens to a body sealed in a tomb for thousands of years? The science of decay, preservation, and the strange journey of human remains after death awaits us in the following segment. As our long descent through history nears its quiet end, let us reflect on one final question that lingers gently in the mind. If you were truly locked in a tomb, would you be trapped forever? It's a thought that has stirred the imaginations of storytellers, archaeologists, and midnight thinkers alike. The truth, as ever, is more nuanced than fiction might suggest. To begin with, most tombs were never designed to be accessed again, by the living, at least. Ancient builders sealed passageways with thick stone slabs, hidden doors, and cunning architectural tricks. In royal tombs, like those in the Valley of the Kings, corridors might be deliberately backfilled with rubble after the burial. Sometimes, false walls or chambers were included to confuse would-be looters. These features were less about escape and more about eternal protection. And yet, the builders themselves, those silent craftsmen, had to leave. Teams of laborious stonemasons, painters, and priests all needed a way out once the final sealing ceremony was performed. Temporary scaffolding, ropes, and secret exits may have aided their escape, only to be covered up afterward, lost beneath tons of stone and sand. But what if you, somehow, found yourself inside one of these tombs, alive? Imagine you're in a stone chamber, perhaps 50 feet underground. There are no lights, no food, and no tools. The air is still. The walls are smooth, undecorated, and cool to the touch. Perhaps you can feel the faint scent of resin lingering from the burial ceremony. The heavy door behind you, if you can even find it in the pitch black, does not budge. And worse still, even if you did manage to pry it open, it may only lead to another sealed space, or a deep shaft, or a labyrinth of dead ends. Some tombs did include air shafts, narrow vertical channels cut through stone, either for ventilation during construction or as symbolic links to the heavens. But these were rarely large enough for a person to pass through. In reality, escape from a sealed tomb would have been almost impossible without tools, light, or prior knowledge of the layout. Death would come quietly, by thirst, exhaustion, or stillness. But this is where fiction diverges from fact. The myths of ancient trap-laden tombs filled with spikes, rolling boulders, and cursed hieroglyphs are largely the product of modern imaginations. There's little archaeological evidence that ancient Egyptians built mechanical death traps. Their concern was preservation, not defense. Symbolic curses did exist, words carved into stone warning grave robbers of divine punishment. But they were more psychological than physical. The greatest obstacles to escape, then, were not traps or mummies springing to life, but time, stone, and silence. Still, there is a curious comfort in the idea that these tombs, once sealed, were meant to endure. Their stillness was a kind of protection. Their darkness, a cradle for eternity. So, in the end, would you be trapped forever? Yes, most likely, but you wouldn't be alone. Around you would be thousands of years of memory. The presence of ritual. The echo of ancient footsteps. The whisper of linen around bone. And maybe, just maybe, in that profound quiet, you'd find peace too. As we draw the stone slab gently closed on this long journey, let your thoughts drift backward once more, through winding tomb corridors, flickering torchlight, and the soft sound of sand falling through ancient fingers. Tonight, you've wandered through the mystery of Egyptian tombs, not in fear, but in wonder. You've considered the hands that carved the burial chambers, the priests who whispered final rites, and the still air that has held their secrets for centuries. You've walked alongside the living who built these sacred places, and you've lingered among the dead who waited in the dark. You've imagined ropes creaking, shovels scraping, and rituals unfolding under starry skies. You've discovered that a tomb is more than stone and shadow, it is memory set in limestone, faith laid carefully in resin and linen. And most of all, you've explored the quiet tension between finality and eternity. There's something soothing in knowing that for all their solemnity, tombs are ultimately about care. About preparing, preserving, and protecting. About rest. So as you rest now, let that ancient stillness settle over you like desert dust. Let the weight of history press softly around you, not as a burden, but as a blanket. Let the slow rhythm of time lull you further into sleep, where no doors need opening, and no passageways demand escape. You are not locked in. You are safe, still, and deeply at peace. Good night.